Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lora Rolling and this is part 5 of the Fun Flowers Ornament tutorial. This is the Fun Flowers Ornament. It is so cute and colorful. I love all the flowers. And today we are going to take the units that we have made in parts 1 through 4. We're going to combine all those units together, creating the ornament. We're going to add the beads to the cap, and then we're going to add the ribbon. If you haven't completed parts 1 through 4, I'll have them linked down below so you can easily access them. And then once you finish those, then you can come back to this video. Alrighty, well, we just have a few materials to gather, so let's get those listed and then we can get started. Let's go. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to need are the 20 units that we have already completed in parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have 5 of each unit, and I will show you how to add them all together, and then we will do the cap. But we're going to sew all of those units onto our 2.36 inch plastic ornament. So you'll need one of these. You'll also need beading thread. I like to use the Eslon Fire in the color Crystal, and I like the 4-pound. You can use 6-pound thread if you'd like also. And I use a size 10 beading needle. You can use a size 10 or a size 12. I like to cut my thread with wire cutters, and I hold on to my thread with the long nose pliers. When we get to the cap, we're going to be using 5 colors of the 11.0 Miyuki Delicas, and we're going to be using the silver lined green, red, opaque carnation, silver lined sapphire, and the violet. I'm going to just call this green, red, pink, blue, and purple, and I wanted to show you. This is all the blue that I have left, and we need 20 of these, so I got really lucky because I don't have any more of these beads. So getting down to the nitty-gritty for sure. Alrighty, so that'll do it for the cap, and then last but not least, we're going to need a ribbon. This is a 3/4 inch wide ribbon, and I cut it to 12 inches. So that's all we're going to need to complete our project. Let's thread our needle with 5.5 feet of thread, and then we can get started. Okay, so I have threaded my needle, and I have my first triangle, which is going to be a purple triangle. And if you notice, this purple triangle has connector beads on this side. It does not have connector beads on this side or this side. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that those connector beads are on the right hand side, okay? And we're going to turn it so that the top is where we're sewing, okay? So there's this little top quadrant. We're going to start by sewing in to hide our thread. So pick any random bead. I happen to pick this one, and it really doesn't matter which bead you sew through just to secure your thread, but I pull my thread down so that I have about, maybe an inch, maybe a little less. Now I'm going to sew down the bead right next to the one that I'm coming out of. Zigzagging, I'm going to sew up the bead right next to that one. And then I'm going to pull my thread. There's my tail. I'm going to pull my thread until my tail is just hiding in that first bead. And then I'm going to sew up the next bead So we're coming out of this bead. I'm going to sew up the next bead. I'm going to sew down the bead right next to the one I'm coming out of. And then I'm going to sew up the next bead right next to that one. This is securing our tail in. Doing that zigzag really makes it tough to pull that tail out and makes it nice and secure. And now that it is secure, I'm going to just sew up beads until I get to this top bead right here, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this top bead. We're going to sew down the next 2 beads, and now we are in position to add our second purple flower. Okay, so we have our connector beads on the right side. We're going to make sure that our connector beads are on the bottom of our second purple flower. And we're going to make sure that it's not flipped over. I'm going to show you. This would be the wrong way. We have connector beads on the bottom, but if you look at the leaves, it looks like there's one big long leaf right here and one little teeny kind of circle of a leaf. That's wrong. So if that's what yours looks like right now, then you want to flip it over and make sure that the connector beads are on the bottom still, but we have a big long leaf connecting to this one and then a big long leaf connecting to this one. I hope you see the difference. That's very important when you're adding your flowers. You always have to have one long leaf connecting to one flower and the other long leaf connecting to the second flower, okay? So now that we are in position to add our unit, we're going to sew down the second sticky outie on the new unit and the second sticky outie on the first unit. We're going to make sure that our thread is not crisscrossing at all. We're going to sew through the next sticky outie and the next sticky outie on the first unit, making it zigzag like this, making sure that our thread is not crisscrossed in any way. We can pull it tight and merging these 2 triangles together. Now we're going to catch each sticky outie, going all the way down, pulling on our thread, zipping it up until we end in this corner bead of the newest purple flower unit, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of this corner bead, and we have pulled our thread tight enough that there is no thread showing and it's nice and connected. Okay, so there's no room for any more tugging. Let's sew up the next 2 blue beads, which means that we are now coming out of the first sticky outie on this second purple flower. Let's add another purple flower, remembering that there are only connector beads on one side and that side needs to be facing down. We have connector beads on the right side of the bigger unit, and we have no connector beads on the left side of the newest unit. So we're going to catch this second sticky outie and then we're going to sew up the second sticky outie on the bigger unit and the next sticky outie on the newest unit and sew through each sticky outie, and you can pull it to tighten it up. Zigzag your way all the way up until you come to the top corner bead of the newest unit that we just put on, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of the top corner bead of the third purple flower unit, and we are going to put our thread in position to add another triangle. So let's sew through one blue bead right next to that corner bead, and now we are in position to add our first pink flower triangle. Now, if you'll notice, the pink flower triangle has connector beads on the right, connector beads on the bottom, and no connector beads on the left. We are connecting the bottom to the top of this purple flower. So, making sure that those connector beads are on the right-hand side, we're going to connect the bottom. So, let's connect by sewing through this first sticky outie, and then the second sticky outie of the big unit, and then the second sticky outie of the pink flower, and making sure that we're not crossing our thread at all. Let's pull it tight, and now we can zigzag all the way down until we get to this corner bead on the third purple flower unit, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. We're going to sew down the next two beads, and now we are in position to add another purple flower, remembering that our connector beads are on the bottom, making sure that we have the leaves lined up correctly. We're going to catch the second sticky outie on the new unit and zigzag our way down until it's all zipped up, and then we will end in this corner bead on the newest unit, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up the next two beads, and now we're ready to add our last purple flower triangle. Remembering that the connector beads are going to be on the bottom, and making sure that our leaves are lined up. We want to catch the second sticky outie bead, zip it on up until we get to this top corner bead on the new unit, and then I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down one bead, and now we are in position to add our second pink flower bead. Okay, so we're going to have connector beads on the bottom and on the right hand side. If you'll notice, the pink flower that we added already has the big leaf on the top right. Okay, so we're going to do the same exact thing. Our big leaf is on the top, the little leaf is on the bottom. We have connector beads on the right and connector beads on the bottom, and that is how we're going to connect it to the top of this purple flower. So we're going to sew through the first sticky outie bead, and then the second sticky outie on the purple flower, and we're going to pull them together and zip them on up, and then we will end up in this corner bead on the purple flower, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down the next 2 beads, and we are now in position to connect the first purple to the 5th purple. Okay, so we're going to sew through the second sticky outie, and then the second sticky outie, zip it on up until you get to the bottom corner bead of the 5th purple, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now that we're coming out of this bead, we're going to sew through all 5 beads all the way around until we get all of them tightened up together. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we're going to sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then pull the thread tight so that it becomes this tight little circle. And now we're going to sew through the blue bead right next to the bead that we're coming out of, and then sew through the blue bead right above that one, and pull nice and tight, and you'll see that that circle is as tight as can be. Now I'm going to sew through random beads, hiding my thread, until I get all the way up to this bead right here, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this blue bead. We're going to sew up the blue bead and the yellow bead right above to the right hand side of that. And then we are going to sew down 1 blue bead, and now we are in position to add another pink flower. So notice that our flower has the connector beads on the right hand side and the bottom, and then no connector beads on the left, right? And make sure that your connector beads are on the right hand side, that leaf on the top is the big leaf. The lower leaf is the small leaf, okay? If it's not, then just flip it over and turn it once, and it should be the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so we have the connector beads on the bottom. We're going to connect the bottom to the purple triangle. So let's catch that first sticking outie bead, and then the second on the big unit, and pull them together, zip them on up until we get to this corner bead on the new unit that we just added, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up the next 2 blue beads. And we are now in position to add our first orange triangle. So our orange flower is going to have one side with connector beads on it, okay? So making sure that this is the top side and the right side has the connector beads, the left side does not have connector beads, and we're connecting a small leaf on the top to a big leaf on the pink top, okay? So making sure that our leaves are in place, that our connector beads are not on the right, they are on the top, okay? So pick up your second sticky outie on the new unit, on the orange, and then zip it on up, and we're going to end in the orange flower on the left hand corner bead, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of our corner bead. Let's sew through the one blue bead right next to it. And now we are in position to add our first top tier. Okay, so our connector beads are going to be on the right hand side and on the bottom. There are no connector beads on the left, and our leaves are connecting correctly. If they're not, then you just flip it over and they will be. Go ahead and catch the first sticky outie on the bottom of the red flower, the top tier, and the second sticky outie on the orange flower, connecting them together. We're going to zip it on up until we're coming out of the corner bead on the orange flower, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down the next two beads. And now we are in position to add another pink flower, making sure that our connector beads are on the right hand side and the bottom, but not on the left hand side. We want to connect, making sure that the small flower or leaf is on the top and the large one's on the bottom, and that it looks great. Pick up that second sticky outie and zip it on up until we reach this corner bead on the bottom of the orange flower, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this yellow bead. We're going to tighten up the circle of all 5 yellows. So let's sew through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Tighten it up and then sew through 3 more. 1, 2, and 3. Pull nice and tight. And now let's sew up this blue bead right above the bead that we're coming out of. And the sticky outie, and then the sticky outie on the purple side, and the sticky outie on the pink side, and zip it on up until we get to this corner bead on the pink triangle, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up the first 2 beads. One and 2. And now we are in position to add another orange flower. So the way we're going to add this is making sure that the connector beads are on the right hand side. There are no connector beads on the left hand and on the top, and the small part of the leaf is on the top. Okay, so we're connecting the left hand side to the pink flower. So sew through the second sticking out bead and do your zigzag all the way up, zipping it up until you get to this corner bead on the orange flower, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through the next blue bead, and now we are in position to put a red flower on. Alrighty, so making sure that our connector beads are on the right hand side and that our leaves line up. Let's catch this first sticking out bead and we're going to zip it on up. All the way until we reach the corner bead on the orange flower, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down the next two blue beads, and we are in position to connect this pink triangle to the orange triangle. So sew through that second sticky outie and go ahead and zip it on up until you end in this corner bead, and I will see you there. Okay, so now we can tighten up this circle. Sew through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull nice and tight, and now we're going to sew through we're coming out of this bead right here. We're going to sew through the blue bead above that, and then the blue bead above that one. It's nice and tight. Now weave your thread, choosing any beads that you want until you reach this blue bead up at the top, and I'll see you there. So we're coming out of this blue bead. We're going to sew up the blue bead and the yellow corner bead that is on the pink flower triangle. Now we're coming out of that corner bead, and we're going to sew down the next two blue beads. 1 and 2, and now we are in position to add another orange flower. Okay, so we need to have our triangle in position where our connector beads are on the right hand side. There's no connector beads on the left hand side, and there's no connector beads on the top. We also see that our leaf is small on the top and larger on the bottom, and so that's how we know that we're going to connect it correctly. Go ahead and sew through the second sticking out bead just like that. And the next sticking out bead, and zip it on up. Oh, I'm getting my threads crossed here. Zip it on up until you've reached this bottom corner bead. Oh, I pulled it too far. This bottom corner bead on the orange triangle that we are just now putting on. And I'll see you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up the next 2 blue beads. And now we are in position to put another pink triangle on. So making sure that we have no connector beads on the left-hand side, and we do have connector beads on the right, and we do have connector beads on the bottom. Okay, also make sure that your leaves are correct. If they're not, then just flip your flower over and find the correct position. And now we're going to sew through this second sticky outie, and the second sticky outie on the orange. Zip it on up all the way until you have reached the top corner bead of the pink that we just put on. Can I get in there? Okay, there we go. So we're going to end right there, and I will see you in a second. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. We're going to sew down the next 2 blue beads. And now we're going to put another orange flower on. So we don't have connector beads on the left, we don't have connector beads on the top, and we do have connector beads on the right. Okay, so knowing that, we're going to sew down the second sticky outie bead, and we're going to zip it on up until we get to the corner bead on the pink flower, and I'll meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down the next 2 blue beads. And now we can connect our purple flower to the pink flower. So through the second sticking out bead, and the second on the pink flower, zip it on up all the way down until you are at this corner bead on the bottom of the pink flower triangle. And I'll see you there. Okay, so now we're in coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up our circle. So through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to go around all 5 again. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then sew through 1. Oops. Pull nice and tight. And now we're going to sew, we're coming out of this yellow bead, we're going to sew up the blue bead right above it. we're going to sew through the blue bead right above that. And then we're going to sew through all the random beads, whatever beads you want to, as long as you're hiding your thread. And we're going to end up coming out of this blue bead right here. And I will see you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this blue bead. We're going to sew up the next blue bead and the yellow bead above that. And then we're going to sew down the blue bead right next to that one. And now we are in position to add another red flower, making sure that the connector beads are on the right hand side and on the bottom. We're going to catch this first sticking out bead and zip it on up until we reach this corner bead in the red flower that we just put on. And I'll see you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of this yellow bead. Let's sew up the next two blue beads. And now we can add another red flower, making sure that our connector beads are on the right hand side. We're going to catch the second sticking out bead and we're going to zip it on up until we finish with our needle coming out of this connector bead. So it will be zipped up like that, and then we'll be coming out of that connector bead. And I will see you in a sec. Okay, so now we're coming out of this bead, and we need to connect it by sewing down the next bead. That will tighten up that gap, and then sew down the next bead, the green bead, and then the bead that is to the left below that one, so it's the second green bead, and travel all the way down until you reach this corner bead right here. It's the second yellow one from the gap, and I'll meet you there. Okay, now we get to tighten up this circle. So let's sew through all 5 beads. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and sew through 3 more beads. 1, 2, and 3. Tighten up the circle, pulling our thread tight. Now we're going to sew up the next blue bead, sew through the first sticky outie on the red flower triangle, and go ahead and zip it on up, making sure you pull nice and tight so that circle stays nice and tight. And then we are going to finish by ending in this upper corner bead on the orange flower, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down the next 2 blue beads, And now we're ready to attach the pink to the orange triangle. So sewing through the second sticky outie on the pink triangle. And zipping it on up all the way until we end in this corner bead right here, and I'll meet you there. Okay, now we get to tighten up the circle. So through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then sew through 3 more. 1, 2, and 3. Pull tight, sew through the blue bead right next to the bead that we're coming out of. And the blue bead right above that one. Pull nice and tight, and then sew through random beads until you get to this bead right here, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this bead. Let's sew up the blue bead and the yellow bead on the pink flower, and sew up the next 2 blue beads, 1 and 2. And now we are in position to put our last orange triangle on. So making sure that we have connector beads on the bottom of the triangle, because it's going to end up attaching to this one, and that we don't have connector beads on the left hand side. Make sure also that it is flipped so that our leaves connect correctly, and just like that. And now we can sew through the second sticking out bead, zip it all the way up until you have reached this corner bead on the new orange triangle that we are adding. Okay, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this top corner bead on the new one that we just added. Let's sew through the next blue bead, and now we are in position to put our last red flower on. This should be your last triangle that you're adding. Make sure that the connector beads are on the right hand side, and we're going to connect it to the first sticking out bead on the bottom of the triangle, and zigzag it all the way until you reach the top corner bead on the orange triangle, and I will see you there. All right, so now we are coming out of this top corner bead, and we only have 1 gap to fill, right? So what we need to do before we sew that up is we need to add our clear ornament. We're gonna pop it in, and you'll see that if you fold all of them up, that it fits just perfectly. We just have to sew them all. But before we do that, I'm going to show you a little trick. If you take the cap off, it makes it so much easier to sew on this ornament. So what I like to do is I like to pull the loop until it's just kind of sitting. Have you noticed this? And so you can just like take it off, put it on, and it's very sturdy that way. I'm going to set this cap aside without pushing that loop down. I'm just going to let it kind of sit to the side like that, okay? So when we put it back on, it's going to be so simple to put on. Okay, now back to the ornament. We're coming out of this bead. We have our ornament in place on the inside, and we're going to sew down the next 2 blue beads. And we're going to catch this second sticking out bead on the pink triangle, and we're going to zip it on up all the way down until we are on the bottom corner bead of the orange triangle, and I'll see you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. We're going to sew through all 5 beads, tightening up the circle. 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we're going to sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull tight, and now we're going to sew. You'll see that this one is already sewed together. The next one is not, so we're going to sew up. Oh, we're going to sew through 1 more. And now we're going to sew through this blue one, the next blue one, and then random beads all the way up until you get to this top blue one right here. And I will see you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this blue bead. Let's sew up the next blue bead and sew through the yellow bead. And now we're going to go around all 5, closing up this circle. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 2 more. 1 and 2, and pull tight. And now you can sew up that blue bead. I almost said blue button. And the next blue bead right above it. And now we're going to catch the second sticky outie and zip it on up until you reach this top bead. It's the one that is sticking out on the top. So it is a connector bead on the top. And I will see you there. Okay, now I always push my top of the cap over as far back as I can. It'll move around in here, so just push it kind of out of the way. Makes it easier for you to sew. And you see we have this little gap right here, so we're going to close it by sewing down the bead right next to the one we're coming out of. And then we're going to sew down the green bead, and we're going to sew up the bead right next to the green bead, down the red bead, and then up the light red bead and the dark red bead right above it. Okay, And the reason we're doing this is because we need to follow the thread path, okay? So we can, there's already a thread going from this bead to this bead. So now we can just jump on over and then sew up the bead right next to that. So down the bead right next to that, both white beads. Oh, I caught a green in there. Both white beads. Now we can sew up the green bead and up the second white bead. Oh, am I out of frame? There we go. The second white bead, just like that. Oh, I hope I was in frame that whole time. And I probably wasn't. I'm sorry. Okay, and down the connector bead. And now we are in position to start zigzagging and zipping up this side. So all of those beads, zip them on up, catching all of the connector beads, all of the sticky outies. And I will meet you right here. Okay, so now we're coming out of this bead. Let's tighten up this circle by sewing through all 5 beads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull it nice and tight. Sew up the blue bead that's right above the bead we're coming out of. There we go. And the bead right above that one. And now weave your thread all the way up until you have gotten to that top connector bead, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of our top connector bead. Let's sew down the bead right next to that, and that will tighten up the gap. And now we're going to sew down the green bead that's just below that bead, and then sew up the white bead, sew up the second to the end white bead. Oh. Well, it's the second white bead from the end. If that makes sense. It doesn't, I know. Okay, and then sew down the next bead, and we're just getting our thread in position to be able to cross over, following our thread line, right, our thread path. So now we're going to sew up the red bead, and now we can do the crossover to this side by sewing down the red bead, sewing up the white bead, and sewing down both white beads, and then sewing up the green bead and the white bead, second white bead from, or the middle white bead on the top, I should say. And now we can sew down our connector bead, and we are in position to start zigzagging and zipping up these two triangles. So catch the first sticking out bead, and then the next sticking out, and zip it on up, and I will meet you in this connector bead right here. Okay, now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through the 5 corner beads to tighten it up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then we're going to sew through, let's see, we're going to sew through 1, 2, 3, 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull it nice and tight. And now we can sew up the blue bead that's right next to the bead we're coming out of. Sew through the blue bead right above that one. And now you can sew through random beads until you get all the way up to this top bead right here. It's the 3rd white top bead, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of this top connector bead. We're going to sew down the white bead and the green bead, closing that gap, and now we're going to sew up the 2, well, first we'll sew up the white bead right next to the green bead that we're coming out of. And then we'll sew up the white bead that's kind of to the left of it. It's the 2nd white bead from the right. And now we can sew down the white bead right next to that and up the red bead. Now we can jump over to this other little panel by sewing down the red bead, up the white bead, down the 2 white beads. See if I can make it through. Oh, it looks like it's just going to let me go through the first one, and now I can sew down the next white one. And then up the green and the white. Oh no, sorry. Up the green and the 2nd or the middle white one on the top. I almost messed up my own thread path. Okay, now we're going to sew down the white connector bead, and now we are in position to zip this up. But because it is the last zip up that we're going to do, I'm going to do it just a little differently. Okay, so we are going to catch the first sticky outie, and the second, just like that. And we're going to zip it, okay? But then we're going to actually move over to going up the 2 greens, and we're going to pull really, really tight. Don't break a bead though. If it's gonna break a bead, then just be very, very careful. And then we can go up the white connector bead up at the top, and now we can close this gap by going down this white bead. And you notice I shift this little cap around as needed. Okay, now I can pull it nice and tight, and I can go down the green bead. If it's starting to get too tight, switch to a size 12 needle, and that will get you through. And now we can start zipping up, okay? So sewing down all 3 of those greens, and now we can start catching the connector beads, and we're going to zip it all the way up until we end up in this corner bead, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up this circle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then go through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull it nice and tight. Now we're going to sew up the blue bead that's right above the bead that we're coming out of. Oh, I sewed through my thread. I don't want to do that. There we go. And then sew through the blue bead right above that one. And now we are actually completed. We have completed the sewing portion, but we want to end our thread. Before we end our thread, I want to go through all of the different flowers, making sure that all of the circles have been completely closed up. And it looks like we got through all of them, which is nice. So now we can end our thread. So I'm going to just sew through 4 or 5 beads. 1, 2, 3. Oh, that doesn't want to do it. Let's see. Catch that one. 3. 4. And I'm good with that. So let's go down, changing direction. So that's 5. And up. Doing that zigzag so that the tightness of that circle doesn't start to loosen up. And then do that again. I'm going to sew through 2 beads. 1 and 2, and then I'm going to zigzag again. Going down the bead next to that one and up the bead next to that one. Okay, now I feel very confident that my thread will not come undone, and my chair is super squeaky, sorry if you heard that. Okay, so I'm going to take my long nose pliers and hold on to the string, and then I'm going to go down with my wire cutters as close to the bead as possible without catching the bead. Don't cut the bead, and just cut off that thread. So now we have completed sewing together our ornament. We're now going to add the cap. So you have your cap that still has its little loop pulled up, right? So it makes it super simple to just put it on and then push the loop down, and it locks your cap on, okay? So now all we need to do is pour out the beads into little piles on the side of the camera, and then we can start creating the cap. Let me do that. You do it too, and make sure that there's at least 2 feet of thread on your needle, and then we can start the cap. I'll see you in a sec. Okay, so I have threaded my needle, and I have picked up 40 green beads. I am going to simply sew through the first bead that I put on, and that will turn it into a circle. And I'm going to leave about a 4 or 5 inch tail. And now I'm going to just do circular peyote. I'm going to pick up 1 bead. I'm going to skip 1 and sew through the next. And at first it kind of looks like a mess, but after you've gotten a couple of the second row beads in, then it starts to really start to form. So now I'm coming out of this bead. I'm going to skip this bead. I'm going to sew through the next. So picking up another bead, I'm coming out of this bead. I'm going to skip this bead. I'm going to sew through the next. Now if I pull it nice and tight, it'll start to form what looks like this, where it's 2 and then 1, 2 and then 1, 2 and then 1. And we're going to add 1 bead in between each bead until we get all the way to here, and that will be the 20th bead. So I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're going to add the 20th bead. We're coming out of this bead. We're going to skip this bead. We're going to sew up the next and the first bead that we added for our second row. So we're sewing through 2 beads, which means that we're stepping up, right? So now we should have what looks like this, and now we're ready to make sure that it fits on our ornament. So the cap is on our ornament. We're going to just put it over and kind of just work it down until it fits. And if you notice, we didn't tie a knot, okay? And that's so that we can make sure that it fits on perfectly. And now we can pull it nice and tight, making sure that it is going to stay put. Although it won't, it's not glued on or anything. So we have to be careful from this point on that it doesn't slip off. Okay, so now we are coming out of this bead. And if you are actually if your thread is coming out of a top bead, you don't have to do this part. But if your thread is coming out one of these bottom beads that's closest to the flowers, then you're going to want to position your thread up at the top. So what I'm going to do that is I'm just going to sew up the bead right next to the bead that I'm coming out of, and the one in front of that one as well. So that's going to pull the thread to the top of the row. And now we are ready to start adding 20 red beads in between. So we're going to pick up 1 and we're going to sew through. We're coming out of this bead. We're going to skip this one and sew through the next. All the while, I'm keeping my finger on the top of the cap so that it won't slip off. Okay, let's pick up one more red bead and sew through the next sticking outie. And continue to do that until you have added 20 beads, and I will meet you all the way over here to add this 20th bead. Okay, so now I'm adding my 20th red bead by sewing through the green bead, and then we're going to also sew through the red bead, stepping us up, and now we are ready to add pink beads. If your cap is getting a little loose like mine is, I'm going to just take the tail and the long thread and pull them away from each other and cinching it back up so it's nice and firm. I'm going to hold the cap on with my finger, and now I'm going to add 20 pink beads. Go ahead and add your pink beads and I'll meet you at the 20th. Okay, so now we're sewing on the 20th bead, and I'm going to sew through the red and the pink, and do a nice little tighten. And now we get to add our blue beads. So one blue, and we'll do this 20 times. Then we will add our purple, and I will meet you when we're done adding our 20th purple. So do 20 blues and 20 purples. Okay, so we are adding our last bead, and of course stepping up so that we can pull the tail one last time and the long thread opposite direction so it makes it nice and snug. That's as snug as it's going to get. We've got a nice colorful cap now. Now we are coming out of this purple bead. We are going to go the opposite direction through the pink bead below it, and then change directions again to the green bead. So we did a little zigzag. We're going to go up 2 beads. Oh, we actually caught both of them, the red and the green. And now we're going to zigzag again through the pink, and then the opposite direction through the purple. And I actually went through the blue, the pink, and the red. And that's perfect because now I feel comfortable that I can cut my thread. So holding on to my thread with my long nose pliers, I'm being very careful not to pull the beaded cap off of the aluminum. I'm going to snip my thread, and now I'm going to do the same exact thing with my tail. I'm just going to use the same needle. I'm going to thread my tail, and that was very lucky to get it on the first try, right? And now I'm coming out of this green bead right here. I'm going to sew the opposite direction through the red bead, and then once again the opposite direction through the blue bead, and then I'm going to sew also through the pink and through the red and through the green. And now I can zigzag again through the pink in the opposite direction and through the purple, and this is where I can sew through the purple and the blue. Let's see if I can do that. Well, no, I could just get through the purple this time. So let's go through the blue, the pink, and the red. And now I feel good about how secure my tail thread is. So I'm going to take the needle off. I'm going to hold on to the thread and snip it. Okay, so now all we have to do is add our ribbon, okay? So we're going to take our ribbon, which is 12 inches. We're going to fold it in half so that our edges are flush up against each other. And then we're going to just tie a knot. I'm going to try to make a pretty knot, folding over 2 fingers and then pulling both those ends through very slowly until I get this. Okay, so now we have a loop. I'm going to take this loop, I'm going to pinch it, and now it will fit through the little metal loop. Pull it through, and then open it up, and now I'm going to put the ends through the loop, and I'm going to try to do this neatly too. Okay, so pulling it down so that it finishes off just like that. Now you have your ornament, you have a beaded cap on your ornament, and you have your ribbon, which means your ornament is complete. Congratulations! We have now completed the fun flower ornament. This was such a fun project, and I just love that you are here beading along with me. Remember to like and